Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, everybody. I hope today's presentation will give you some indication of the ways that we work at Jess. Clearly, we've got a lot to learn. It's an ongoing journey, but this has been a process over time that I hope to be able to share some context for our ways of working. So I'm going to be looking at how we use data to identify and respond to profiles of needs. And I sort of, when I put my tweet out yesterday, I said context is king, and I hope that's going to be a very strong thread throughout what I share with you today. And perhaps I'll start then with data that we use across all our cohorts, and maybe the case for you too, where we're looking at what we refer to as our AAA data: ability, attainment, and aptitude. And this provides a first layer of available data for all our students. And at Jess, all staff members play a role in its analysis, albeit with a different perspective or lens, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. And we use it in many different ways. So, for example, perhaps we'd look at identifying discrepancies between ability and attainment, or we'd be looking to triangulate in order to corroborate and contextualize our data for next steps. And similarly, it's used as a scaffold for a whole child data process. And this is really where I'm going to be focusing today as we dig deeper to explore a potential profile of need. You may have seen this image before. I know that myself and Luke Rees, who developed it together, have both shared it. This provides some sense of that different perspective and lenses I mentioned just a moment ago, reflecting on the ways in which our different stakeholders will engage with the same data. In this instance, it's the CATS data. And essentially, we're looking at different sides of the same puzzle. And the same may be true for other tests that we engage with in our cohort groups as well. For example, the progress test for English, maths and science. For one of the perspectives, perhaps senior leadership team might be tracking the progress of those cohorts to look at trends, particularly in mind of the Tims and Pearls year groups and such. Similarly, the past data, possibly our counselling team would look at that for a pastoral aspect in looking at common areas for development and areas of concern that we may need to address through intervention or adjustments to our pedagogy. As we move forward, then, each one of the perspectives on that, the image I shared with you just a moment ago, is delved into a little deeper. And in this instance, we're looking at the learning support model. And you can see the four areas where we would work as we begin to dig a little deeper and contextualize. So we're talking about identifying individuals who may be at risk. And that might be those for whom there are data points that fall below a standard score of 85, or those who have an uneven profile where there may be a significant discrepancy across domains. And this is the message I shared before, it's about considering the context. It's essential to do that before we jump into any actions, because that context in itself may steer the decisions we make in response to potential needs. So as a first step, we need to think about the context and consider, particularly if we use the current circumstances with which we're faced, how magnified a challenge may be for an individual student who is now at home with distance learning, and they may be performing differently in accordance to those extraneous variables. So let's have a quick think about what some of those might look like. So one of the things that I would always suggest is the importance for contextualizing within your own setting. So on the left here, you can see a snapshot of some of the data that represents a cohort at Jess. And you can see that we are fortunate that many of our students are performing to the right of that normal distribution curve, which means for us, we have to adjust our thinking and our average range within the school context. We've also got to bear in mind that cognitive abilities are not fixed. And so as they change over time, and there's a breadth and depth to a person's acquired knowledge and experiences that are developed, we need to come back and reflect on that. I mentioned extraneous factors. The current circumstance is the perfect example of that. but there are many ways in which we need to consider each individual data point with caution, depending on how the child may have performed on that given day or any additional barriers they may be facing. And some of those might be things like considering whether this is a student for whom English is an additional language. Are they part of a vulnerable group? Are we aware that they already have identified profiles of need? So lots of factors to consider when reflecting on the data in the first instance. One aspect of what we all consider super important at Jess is reflecting on the whole child. And here you can see a capture of some of our past data for our students in Key Stage 1. For your context, this data is representing students who have been on our SEN or AEN registers. And this gives us an indication of their perception of themselves as a learner and provides the last piece of that AAA data puzzle with aptitude, attitude and attainment. And it's essential then we reflect on all aspects of this. What's particularly notable then is if this is our Key Stage 1 student cohort for AEN and SEN, then having a look at the changing profile that we see for our Key Stage 2 students. What information do we take from this data? Does this indicate that those students have become more aware of their challenges? And if that's the case, how did we respond? So some examples of the way that we've responded to data such as this might be some one-to-one pre-learning or mentoring sessions with particular children who perhaps lack some confidence in themselves as a learner to focus on curriculum content alongside a growth mindset model. We might look at how we're supporting students with strategies for organisation and learning readiness. We might look at the development of PSHE opportunities within our class cohorts. How can we build the confidence of all of our students of determination, which is the terminology that we use locally for students with special educational needs? We might reflect on the level of differentiation and challenge for students. Have we got that right? Are we meeting their needs in regards to their specific learning barriers? We would engage with our counselling team and make referrals as appropriate. Perhaps most importantly is the discussions that we would have with parents and how we would raise their awareness of the challenges that may be facing their children at given times during their learning and take from them context that might help us to mitigate for some of those data points. Staff training, empowering them to empower their students, and also leadership opportunities for our students. How can we reflect on the ways that these children who may face some barriers in some areas of their learning, how can they excel in the areas of their strength? How can we utilise that within what we're building into their experiences? So I put two images here. I know the one on the left is sort of very familiar to many of us, and that's the sort of behaviour iceberg, where typically we're seeing a manifestation of challenges and that's often identified perhaps by difficult behaviour. But we've got to be really careful about our perceptions of that. And as we do that with behaviour and we become more mindful of that, so I would argue we need to do that in regards to the potential presence of learning difficulties. We see those visible challenges above the surface, but we have to be careful not to draw conclusions from that information alone. It can steer the direction of our conversation and our investigation, but we need to make sure that we've got a potential understanding of that disharmony and where it's come from. So what does that mean for us? If we're only seeing some parts of that data, what do we need to do to dig a little deeper, to discover the root cause? This is an aspect of one of our identification flowcharts that's been developed between the learning support team and the counselling team. And this is going to be very dependent on your setting and your systems and structures. But one of the most important components I should add here is that it should always be flexibility. One model will never fit all of your students. But there are some key principles that you can consider. And when we're thinking about the whole child with the physical, social, emotional, sensory needs, and cognitive and communicative needs, then we can think about all of those areas as they are intertwined and not mutually exclusive. You might want to think about developing a TAC model, a team around the child model that brings everybody together, past and present voices from the staff within school, the school and the home context, both from parents and where developmentally appropriate, the students too. A graduated response. We hear this language a lot, and I know that it's going to be something that we'll all be considering, but investigations for identification must be personalised to the child and the family. And I think it's important at this stage to say that we need to be sensitive to the journey that these families are on. You can see within this image here that we reference some time frames, but those need to be flexible. They need to be in accordance with the readiness of this family to pursue any challenges that their children may have. Sometimes the process, the journey can happen fairly quickly and families are confident and comfortable with the support. Other times we need to take it at a pace that's more ready for them. You'll see here in this image that we talk about quality first inclusive teaching. That universal design for learning is so important, and every student should be able to expect differentiated, adapted learning appropriate for them within their typical learning environment. Now, for some children, however, when they are experiencing some additional needs, we might just learn a little bit more about the context of that and help them to close that gap quite quickly, in which case we may make some adaptations, we may look at potentially some short-term intervention, and hopefully those gaps will close and they will be successful with the continued journey with the quality first inclusive teaching. But what about those for whom that hasn't happened? The orange box here indicates a next step. After about 6 to 8 weeks, typically, or as appropriate, as I mentioned before, to the needs of the child, there would be a more formal referral process so that we can continue to look a little bit deeper. At that time, it would include a capture of anecdotal observations in the classroom, from parents at home, the results of any other relevant cohort data that we might have. One of the tools that we use are our profile questionnaires, where we ask teachers for some very specific checklist responses. Is the child able to focus? Have they got fine motor difficulties? And so on and so forth. And that will depend on the context of discussions around the needs of the child. We might then find ourselves moving on to completing an internal screener battery appropriate to the apparent profile of needs. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little while. And we might equally have one of those TAC meetings, a team around the child to gather further context and to agree to those next steps. From our perspective, it's always been very important to involve parents as soon as possible within these discussions. They have so much valuable insight on their children, and also it's an important part of building that trust over time. So the anecdotal data, as we start to build in around the other data, might include something looking at well-being. So a partnership between class teachers and counselling and learning support is super important, particularly for those students who may be facing some social and emotional barriers to their learning. Looking at summative assessments in regards to the AAA cohort data, parents, families, context, possibly we may know that there's a family member who already experiences or has experienced some barriers to learning. They may offer some context to mitigate for some of the anomalies, and they might provide some additional information to support the presence of a potential profile of need. I've already mentioned observations, but they don't necessarily just need to be from your class-based teachers. They might be from specialists, which is the terminology that we use in our setting, referring to PE staff, language teachers, computing teachers. Who's to say that they don't have a specific perspective on the strengths and challenges of this student? Playground supervision. How does the child interact with their peers during those less formal moments of learning? Senior leaders, possibly they have some context that we're not necessarily aware of in our day-to-day capacity. Parents, and of course, possibly even the child themselves. Learning conversations, these happen for us on a day-to-day basis, but can be formally recorded using a universal record keeping system, which will help us to track a profile over time. Screener testing I've mentioned, and then that historical context and external testing, excuse me, is the last part very often of the puzzle in terms of identification, where we might engage with those assessors, educational psychologists, occupational therapists, speech and language therapists, and similar. I was really pleased to see that GL shared a literacy assessment flowchart, which operates perhaps a little like our own flowchart in terms of the process and graduated approach that we would use to filter those potentially at-risk students. These flowcharts, as I said, need to be used as a scaffold. We can't be governed by them in their entirety because we need to personalise the assessment process where necessary, making it part of the assess, plan, do, review model. So intervention should be planned to respond to those gaps in learning, and then should be used to monitor, being monitored by pre and post program data. The reason we would do that is to consider not only the child's success within the intervention, but also whether the intervention is of itself robust and meeting our expectations. So what would be the most appropriate test that we might use, and when might we use them? Here we can see some cohort data. This is genuine cohort data from Jess with some students, that stand out perhaps. This is year 3 and year 5 data set where you can see the CAPs and their progress tests in English and maths represented. So from this sample data, who would we move beyond this with, and who stands out and why? So there might be different people within your settings that would stand out if the data was represented within your context. Within mine, for example, student A, who's in year 3, has a discrepancy between their CATS verbal and their progress test in English. Is that an anomaly? Are they underachieving? Is it the style of the test that was the issue for this particular child, who, for your information, has a profile of dyslexia? Student D, for example, also in year 3, below average CATS verbal score, which appears to be discrepant with their progress test in English. Again, is that an anomaly? Could there be an EAL component? Are they overachieving? Was it a performance on the day? And so on and so forth. Year 3, child E, where all seem to be in average ranges, but there's a low PTM score. Is that underachieving a performance on the day? And so on. But we have to be aware of making assumptions. So if you look at the scores of student J in year 5, this child, although her scores appear across the board to be well within average ranges, does in fact have a mild profile of dyslexia. So we need to be cautious, as I said before, about how we engage with our data at face value and how we dig deeper to learn a little more. So we'll all perhaps be aware of the average range for our CATS scores, where we would anticipate all of those data points to fall between 110 and 90. I mentioned to you before that from a JESS perspective, we might actually look a little upward of that for some of our students. But in this regard, we have to be mindful that different assessments have different average ranges. So I would always recommend that you go back to check on those to ensure that you are analysing your data effectively. So in this regard, what does it mean if we have a student with this profile? And this is in fact a student that we have within our context. And you can see here the blue data there were the data points for this child in year 3, and the yellow were the data points for this child in year 5 for their CATS. We can see an uneven or spiky profile. So what does this mean? We can see that there is, particularly in the year 3 data, a discrepancy of 17 standard points between the verbal and the quantitative. Similarly, with the year 5 CATS, we see perhaps a little bit more of an even profile across the board, but a dip with the spatial. Similarly, I have another example here, Again, this is data for one of our students where you can see a significant discrepancy, but also some data points that show that this child is perhaps working with some challenges across all areas of learning. I'll come back to these two children a little bit later to talk you through what our process was in this regard. But for now, let's have a look at some of the assessment choices we might make based on the data we have as we begin to look deeper at identifying needs. So typically a child presenting with literacy related challenges who might be resistant to adaptations or interventions that we've put into place, as I said before, would undergo a battery of additional screeners. Now, we would always seek parental permission to do that. They're part of that conversation. And then our results are summarised in a report that's shared as part of a TAC meeting for feedback. Assessment processes for somebody with potential literacy difficulties, typically at GES, would include either the Lucid LAS or the COPS, an early YARC or YARC, depending on where they are at, developmentally speaking, and then a test of phonological awareness, like the FABs, for example. If there are barriers apparent, and tests may also indicate some difficulties with language, we might also then include something like the BPVS and or the WellCom or similar. And then we might include additional tests depending on the apparent barriers. So things like visual processing or visual stress or auditory processing may become component factors as we begin to look a little deeper. So just to cover some of those, and I'm sure you may be very familiar with many of these assessments, but the Lucid COPS I mentioned before and the LAS, which will be on the next slide, these are an excellent tool for looking at those potential profile of literacy difficulties. You might note my terminology. I'm not referring to dyslexia, and that's a very deliberate choice. We would never allude to parents any particular labels of need because we're not qualified to do so. So we're very particular about using the terminology of literacy difficulties or numeracy difficulties or difficulties with attention. So in regards to the Lucid COPS, we're looking at working memory, phonological awareness and processing, and auditory discrimination, colour discrimination, and this would be ideal for those younger learners. And then as we move into those children, perhaps into Key Stage 2 and on into Key Stage 3, we'd be looking at the Lucid LAS. Some of the similar testing tools there, looking at visual and auditory memory, phonological processing, and then moving into single word reading, sentence reading, spelling and reasoning. So they may begin to help you to develop a potential profile of need for these children. I mentioned the YARC and the early YARC. We actually use these not only as part of our assessment for profiles of need, but we also use the YARC as a post-assessment for some of our reading interventions, which includes the Better Reading Programme, so we can get pre and post data. But the YARC is used to look at phonological skills, letter sound knowledge, word reading, decoding and rate of reading comprehension, depending on the age of the test. So the early reading age there you can see is probably used more typically with students in Key Stage 1 and possibly some of our older students within the early years. I mentioned before an assessment for looking specifically at phonological development, awareness, naming speed, alliteration, and so on and so forth. The FAB2 is a perfect example of this and becomes part of that kind of core assessment set that we use. I also mentioned if we're looking at students who may have some barriers to their specific expressive and receptive language, then we might use something like the WellCom or the BPVS to have a look at those elements of receptive and expressive language. And these are fantastic, particularly the WellCom, because it takes it right back to those very, very young ages for development. So great to be using even in your foundation stage year groups. And then there we can see the BPVS that we might use. These assessments obviously are very broadly looking at children who may be faced with some challenges within their literacy. What about those students who are faced with challenges in their numeracy? Of course, things like the LAS and the COPS include very important elements about working memory, which will overlap. But one of the other things that we need to think about if we're seeing a child who's having some potential difficulty with number is how can we test those elements to dig a little bit deeper? How can we look at whether it's an identification of number, whether it's a counting issue, or looking at computational skills? And that's where we might use the Sandwell early numeracy test for those students. So I've given you a sense of some of the tests that we might use. Now let's have a think. It's really important that this isn't necessarily seen as a linear process. We're not enslaved to the process, but this is an example of what we've talked about so far. We've looked at the cohort data analysis and we've seen there are some low scores or discrepancies. We've informed parents. We've been consulted as a team to help look at adaptations and interventions. Those have been implemented and delivered. We've looked at the evidence we have and corroborated and contextualized that. We've developed some further data by completing those screen as appropriate to need. We've had that TAC meeting in order to inform next steps. We've looked then at the appropriateness of whether an external assessment needs to be sought. And then, and ultimately, if there is a profile of need, we might formally identify those students as students of determination and include them within our inclusion register and think about IEPs. So let me give you some examples of where that process has happened. You'll remember before I spoke to you about child A. This was the young person who is now in year 5, was in year 3 when I showed you that first set of data. You can see here the process through which we went in terms of the data that we collected. You can see we went back as far as end of year 2 was when we began to have conversations with the family about thinking about those next steps for assessment. What had happened in the run-up? Interventions had been put in place, first class at number to address some potential barriers in number, BRP, the Better Reading Programme. The child had had some occupational therapy to assist specifically with handwriting. In year 2, there'd been a repetition of the Better Reading Partnership Programme, and we'd also included some work with spelling and phonics. And then you can see the various screener tests that we completed with the child as he moved on into year 3. As we add into that part of the puzzle then, the data that has been represented by the CATs from year 3 and from the PAS, we can begin to see that this child particularly stands out for his apparent signs of anxiety related to the challenges he was experiencing with learning in terms of his perception of self represented through the PAS. In fact, this was the area of most concern to parents and to us in terms of helping this young person to understand themselves as a learner. And as a consequence of all of this data, we then agreed with parents that it was about the right time to pursue an external assessment. And we can see that that external assessment indicated for us some significant barriers in core skills that might help with the progression of literacy. And this child has a profile of dyslexia. And from that data, we have then been able to continue to plan, continue to reflect on his challenges to make sure he's able to enjoy inclusive experiences in his typical learning environment and to measure our interventions to match to his needs. I also showed you the data for another young man who's with us in year 3. This child has got some significant challenges across the board, and we can see that we have been able to track his progress with data from both our year 1 and year 2 end of year tests. We've also had quite a significant level of support in place for this child who has been resistant to those interventions, and by that I mean obviously they're not helping to close the gaps as we might anticipate with the level of support that he had been experiencing. We completed assessments in year 1 and in year 2, and ultimately that led to a decision for the family to pursue an external assessment. And in fact, we had 2 external assessments for this child, both a speech and language assessment, which was completed in year 1, and then further to that, an educational psychology assessment completed in year 2. And then, as I said, as we look again, you can see that this particular child has quite high levels of self-worth and is really quite resilient. And I would like to say that's definitely an ongoing profile, which is fantastic in terms of continuing to help this child feel successful in their learning, and to help us to understand the strengths and the challenges that each of the children have when we're looking a little deeper. So one of the things I wanted to just make mention of is the importance of where we started. I've put that image there of the tree and thinking about what's going on below the surface. And this is just one of the examples of where we might see what manifests above the surface as an anxiety or an anxiousness for coming into school. Why? Because the child doesn't want to leave their parents. Why? Because they're worried about the pressures of the classroom, for example. But why? Because they've got difficulties maintaining the pace of learning. But why? Because the challenges with their working memory and the processing. But why? Because they have that profile of dyslexia. And it is only as we continue to ask those but why questions and analyse them with careful consideration of context can we then get it right for that child and for their family. And that is everything I have to share. So I welcome any questions.